Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We're so thrilled to have you here today as we welcome Kathleen DuVal and her book, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. And the Gilder Lehrman Institute thanks Citizen Travelers, the nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of the Travelers Companies, for their continued support of Book Breaks. And we also want to thank all our viewers as well for their support. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined today by my friend Ryan, who'll be taking your questions in the second half of the program. And without further ado, we are so thrilled to have today Dr. Kathleen DuVal, who is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's the author of Independence Lost: Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, which was a finalist for the George Washington Prize, and co-author of the textbook Give Me a Liberty and American History, which we featured on this program. So you can watch that in our Book Break archives. Welcome, Kathleen. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Gina. It's such a pleasure to be back.
Yes. So just starting off, can you give us an overview of Native nations?
Sure. It's a short overview of Millennium in North America. It's designed to give a reader sort of one place to look at the long arc of Native history, the history really of North America over the last 1,000 years. So it starts about 1,000 years ago in North America, when North America was, of course, all native peoples, when no Europeans or Africans or Asians had come. And it talks some about the history of 1,000 years ago, changes that happened across the continent with various native nations even before the arrival of Europeans. Then, as the book goes along, it talks about more than 200 years of interactions with Europeans and Africans, in which native nations were still most of the population of North America, had most of the power on the continent, something that I think a lot of people don't remember. And so one of the things the book tries to do is sort of slow things down and talk about this quite long period of centuries in which there were both very strong native nations on the continent and European colonies. Then it goes to the present. So there's a period of increasing power of the United States, some of these sort of worst times for native nations, that when they were almost destroyed, when parts of the United States was trying to destroy native nations. And then goes to today, to the Renaissance that's going on among native nations today, and then sort of the long history of their survival. So the main themes are nations, right? The native people have always been polities. They've always organized themselves in something that we might call nations. And then I should also say I focus on a few different native nations. I really focus on about 8 of them, and try to make it all sort of digestible to the reader by letting them get to know some particular nations in a little more depth.
Yeah, and speaking of this, in your introduction, you give a few notes on language, which I thought was fascinating. Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's, I think all of us, teachers, all of us who deal with this kind of thing know that language changes. Language matters a lot. The kinds of words we use to describe ourselves and describe other people matter a lot. So I really follow the guidance of actually a couple of my former graduate students who are now professors themselves, Brooke Bauer and Elizabeth Ellis. And they wrote a lovely article in the Journal of the Early Republic where they talk about different kinds of names to use for Indigenous people and different circumstances in which Indigenous might be right, circumstances in which Native might be right, circumstances in which Indian might be right. There are still Native peoples who call themselves Indians, and what's most important is to call people what they want to be called, no matter who you're talking about, right? And then what I try to do, and what I think most scholars of Native nations try to do, is whenever possible, actually not use any of those words and use a more specific tribal name like Choctaws or Cherokees or Navajos, and try to stay away from those big general terms when possible, because there are well over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States today, not counting state recognized tribes and tribes in Canada and Mexico. So there are a lot of different polities, and using the names that they use for themselves, I think is really important.
Yeah, and in chapter 1, you start in 1006. Can you tell us what's special about that date?
Right. So 1006, one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is bring Native America a little bit more into world history. I think world history textbooks, world history classes tend to only bring this part of North America into the story once Europeans get here. So pre-European, you might learn about the Aztecs, you might learn about the Mayas, but there's this big hole as if nothing's happening north of central Mexico until Europeans get here. So one of the things I try to do is talk about some things that people all over the world might have been thinking about, even in a time that we don't have written records for North America. So in 1006, there was a comet that people wrote about all around the world. So we have written records from places where people kept written records. And they describe it as being brighter than the moon at night, visible during the day. And you just know in a time like that, where you have to imagine, no, there are no street lights, right? There's no light pollution. This is a big deal. And people all around the world were talking about it. And even though we don't have written records and I wasn't able to find any oral histories talking about it from North America, we know people were talking about it at the time. And then another thing that sort of helps lead into some of the things I talk about in that first chapter, that comet happens, and then another major comet happens about 50 years later, and you see some big changes that happen in North America, maybe related to that. It is sort of universal in the long past that when major things like that happen in the sky, people sort of rethink, how they live and whether they want to live differently, or something is telling them to live differently. And so almost immediately after that second comet, so these two comets that come in pretty quick succession, we see the rise of Cahokia. Cahokia was a huge city, sort of huge for standards of the time, in what's now Illinois, right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. They sort of raised a town that was there before and built this city on top of it. And at the same time, among the sort of urban civilizations of what's now Arizona, there was a major building, sort of time of building, like it already existed, but it grew even more in that very same time period. And those places are very far apart, right? And so it seems that some of the impetus for urbanization and sort of centralization that happened, that was in place in the years after that, may have been sparked at least by conversations that came out of seeing those comets.
Yeah, and something we talked about before we went on air is just about how much science plays a role in this book, which was something that really surprised me. And can you tell us a little bit about the medieval warm period and the little ice age and how they affect the story?
Yeah, I in no way intended to write a book with much science in it, but I'm delighted that it turned out that way. So this same period, so the comets may have been this spark, but the sort of reason that urbanization was possible was because of the medieval warm period. So the medieval warm period is a time when, as the name implies, the parts of the globe became warmer, had therefore longer growing seasons. They also had more predictable weather. And so that is the period in which large-scale agriculture spread to our part of North America, so north of central Mexico. It's also the time that large-scale agriculture spread to Western Europe and spread to some parts of Africa. So if you sort of imagine there's a sort of around the equator, it had long been warm enough for large-scale agriculture. It really hadn't been in those regions that are sort of parallel to ours in the Northern Hemisphere. And so that was there had been agriculture before in all of those places, but large-scale agriculture was possible now. And large-scale agriculture is essential for building cities, right? You need some kind of food base that is that some part of the labor can be put into. So some of your people work on food, and other people are freed then to be artisans and priests and political leaders and not spend their time making food for themselves and the people. So this is all over the world, this is a change we see in this time period of the possibility. Certainly not every place urbanizes or develops large-scale agriculture, but the possibility of large-scale agriculture. And there are parts of North America that take up that possibility and build fairly good-sized cities.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, this book covers so much ground. And I was wondering for you, in your research, what was sort of some of your favorite discoveries or individuals you came across?
Yeah, so some of my I guess since we're on this early period, one of my favorite things was that I went to this, the whole book tries to, no matter what the time period is, integrate Native voices from today and what Native scholars, particularly, whether they be in tribes or be in colleges or schools of various sorts, what they say about this past. And so I knew that I wanted to do something like that with the longest ago part of this book, the part that's 1,000 years ago. And it was only as I was reading oral histories from descendants, the descendants of these cities. Now, these are cities that were in Arizona and New Mexico and Illinois, but also all across the Mississippi Valley, both sides of the Mississippi. So today's southeast and into the west a little bit. So lots and lots of native nations today are descended from these cities of 1,000 years ago. There are oral histories in many, many different nations that talk about this distant past, and particularly, we haven't quite gotten to this yet, but particularly about the fall of these cities and why the urbanization decreased in around the 1200s, the 13 and 1400s. And so one of the things that I enjoyed most was seeing that, seeing this time that we sort of sometimes think of as only archaeology has something to say, and there's been this long history of puzzling over why these cities fell, why cities like Cahokia fell, and assuming there were no answers among Native peoples to help figure out those questions, but it turns out there totally are. Like in their oral histories, in their knowledge today, there's a lot of information about even the very distant past.
Okay, well, now can you tell us maybe about the falling of those cities?
Yeah. So quite dramatically, urban populations, urban centers across North America. So again, not central Mexico, but north of there, what's now northern Mexico and the United States. Urbanization hadn't spread so much into Canada. So, but United States and northern Mexico, urban centers in many, many places across river valleys there that had arisen during the medieval warm period. Almost all of them fell after that. So beginning in the 1200s, the planet generally moved from the medieval warm period, which sounds nice for growing things, to the Little Ice Age. Not as nice for growing things. Shorter growing season, colder planet, and less predictable weather. So, and especially in the 1200s, there's this sort of in between the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, there's a period of droughts, but also of floods, not good for large-scale farming. Either one of those things is not good for large-scale farming, particularly the civilizations in the Southwest, in New Mexico and Arizona, parts of northern Mexico, just really very much lost the ability to farm on such a large scale. And what they did, what we can see in the archaeological record, and what we can also hear in oral histories, is that Native peoples all across North America chose a different way of life. And chose may not be quite the right verb, because I'm sure it was traumatic. These cities did fall and people had to find new places to live and new leaders and new ways to live. But in looking back at that long history, what oral histories describe is really a choice, is deciding to live differently. In many of these cities had quite powerful leaders. In many cases, they had a permanent elite. So leadership was both political and religious and inherited. So an elite that kept passing that level of power and prestige on to their descendants. Oral histories tell of turning away from that, of deciding not only not to live in cities anymore, to live in towns on a smaller scale, farm still, but on a smaller scale, but also to replace that kind of leadership style, to put new politics in place so that very powerful leaders wouldn't arise again. and instead to have more consensus-based systems of politics. And one of the reasons I think was probably because as the climate cooled and as it became harder to sustain, harder just to grow as much food as they needed for their people, and there's starvation, and there's all the kinds of things that come from not having enough food for everybody. Many of the leaders, it seems, tried to take more and more power, or at least seemed not to deserve the power that they had, right? If they couldn't feed the people. And out of that comes this new way of life, new politics, also new economies. So still farming, almost all Native American societies still farmed after this, but not on quite as large a scale, not trying to feed as many people off of the sort of centralized farms. And they began to hunt and fish more than their ancestors had. So you can imagine Europeans come and see this, and they think these are primitive economies, primitive politics. But in fact, they're very sophisticated sort of reworking of systems that seemed not to have worked that well in times of crisis.
And now, can you tell us how the Native peoples react to the Europeans' arrival? Because I know that's been written about a lot, but you approach it in a very unique way.
Yeah. So I'm building on, I think, a generation or so of scholarship that has really looked in depth at interactions between Native nations and colonists, and tried to, as I said in the sort of opener, slow things down. And so there are horrific stories early on of interactions between very violent colonizers and Native Americans. But for the most part, across the continent, when Europeans came, they came in pretty small numbers. Whatever their goals were, and their goals were certainly colonial, right? To take the sort of resources of a place, right? That's what colonialism is. It's not good. But because they were so often outnumbered and so often needed to establish trade with the local people, or sort of the right to sort of access a certain place, maybe to put a fort there or put settlement there, and they had to have permission from the local people. Those Europeans had to make themselves useful in some ways, and they did have useful things, right? They had metal goods, they had all kinds of trade goods that they realized pretty quickly Native people wanted. So there's this long period in most places, and it ranges from, say, the Great Plains, where they almost never see a European, to places like the Mississippi Valley, where they have more regular interaction with a few Europeans, not a large Europeans, to places where Europeans really sort of outnumber Native peoples and take things, right? Take land and take sort of human beings, and then create wars and all kinds of terrible things. But there's this spectrum across North America, where a great number of Native nations actually are able to take advantage of Europeans' presence, and particularly of Europeans' goods, to sort of incorporate some of those things into their economies. They already have these economies that value bringing in new goods, new ideas. Like, the more trade, the better. You can sort of imagine how that comes out of this value that they place on multiple sources of providing for a people, right? That they have this long, or at least some of them have this older history of putting too much into large-scale farming, right? And they value bringing in new goods. New trading partners are a good thing, right? And so, that's a generalization, right? There are many times when violence comes instead, but there's a long period where most Native nations have relationships with Europeans that they control, that the Native nation controls.
Yeah, and that's such a, a great myth that you dispel. Are there some other myths that you encountered that you feel like you kind of were able to clarify?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest is just this way we often drop Native history out of the way we teach history after Indian removal or so. Maybe Wounded Knee pops up, but I think what I hope this book will provide a model for is teaching Native American history as part of North American history from 1,000 years ago through today, without periods when it's not part of things, right? And I think students today, they see Native actors in really popular movies and TV shows, and I think it really is the time to try to bridge that gap and teach our students late 19th century, 20th century Native history and the present, the Native present, and all the things that are going on with Native nations today. I'm not sure how to phrase that, a myth of disappearance at one point or another. And I mean, U.S. history is full of myths of Native disappearance, including so many colonizers, both Europeans and then the US, who thought Native Americans were just about to disappear, that they weren't going to last much longer. And I think, the counter to that is that, in fact, they have very much lasted and are still here today. They've lasted not only as sort of individuals, as descendants of Native Americans, but as Native nations. And so I'd say the correction to that myth is this amazing story of survival.
Are there any individuals who really jumped out at you, who really stayed with you during this work?
Yeah. So there are quite a lot of them. So one of them was a woman named Ruth Muskrat Bronson. Ruth Muskrat is her Cherokee name. Bronson is her married name. And she was a woman who was part of this sort of part of continuing Native history into the 20th century. She was sometimes no, so she's a woman who was active in some of the Native activism groups that got started in the early 20th century, and I think can be part of telling this long history, because she was somebody who, along with quite a few others, came out of things like the boarding schools and things that were just awful, but made something out of that. Boarding schools, for example, were a place where actually Native kids from very different nations met each other and could speak to each other in English, because they didn't have mutually sort of understandable languages. So she's somebody who came out of that and became an activist. She ran the most important Native activism group out of her home in DC for quite some time, and really just sort of kept alive through the worst years, the years of the biggest assaults on Native sovereignty, on Native nationhood in the late 19th century and early 20th century. She and quite a few others on the national level. Plus, I would also say just countless women and men back home in their own nations. Like, as much as U.S. reformers, missionaries tried to tell them over and over that it would be better for them to stop being members of their tribes, to just assimilate into sort of the U.S. population more generally, Ruth Muskrat and others just refused to. They played with the system when they had to, but at their heart, they never gave up. For her, for being Cherokee, she was just never not going to be Cherokee. She was never not going to let the children of her tribe lost track of my negative there. She's not ever going to let them not be Cherokee, right? No matter what she was doing, speaking in English to big groups of non-Native people. None of that made her not Cherokee. At the heart of what she and so many other people were doing through those darkest times was just maintaining who they were.
Yes. Oh, that's a fantastic answer. And we have a lot of teachers in our audience, and I know climate change is a really big issue for our students today. And I was wondering if you could tell us maybe how your book can shed some light on sort of how the past could inform the future with climate change.
Yeah. This is in the book, and there's also, I wrote an article that's online on The Atlantic that might be useful for people to assign. But basically it's a little bit apolitical. I can take it a little out of the political realm because it's so long ago, and the climate was moving in the other direction, and I'm sure was not human caused, right? So this transition from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age is really traumatic. It's just very, we don't have to use much of our imagination to know that massive climate change requires us to change. And Native Americans changed. They changed the way they lived. They lived on a smaller, more sustainable scale as large-scale farming became less possible. And I think it's if not a direct model, it's an inspirational model for people can change, people can adapt, people can live differently, and they really did. So Yeah, I think it would be a useful thing to talk about that's kind of, alongside today's climate change without butting right into it.
And we've discussed how much is covered in this book, and I was wondering what your research process was like, because that's, we always like to.
Yeah. Yeah, so this book is definitely based on many secondary sources that other historians have written for the last last couple generations, really. Historians who've written histories of particular tribes, tribal historians who've been doing tremendous work in not only what they've always done and keeping alive their tribal histories, but also making them more public, more available to the public in all kinds of ways, from cultural centers to books. And so really I did a lot of research sort of in my library at my desk for things that were available online or in books. And my research trips were really not to, as a historian, my research trips have in the past always been to archives. But for this book, my research trips were out to tribes and to go look at cultural centers and talk to people there. I didn't do anything like sort of, I'm not an oral historian. I didn't do deep work that way. But for all of the tribes that I focus on, just to get a sense of how they tell their own histories, and then fold that into what I bring in from historical documents and archaeology, and then I hope that readers will do the same thing. There are just cultural centers and also websites available for Native nations all across the continent. It's actually not hard to find it. So for your region, say, the ways that Native nations there tell their histories. And I think that for teachers, that can be really useful. And so I spent a lot of time just going out to places, talking to people, looking at stuff and learning sort of from them.
Well, our chat is just exploding with questions. So before I pass it over to Ryan, I was wondering what you hope readers take away upon finishing this book.
Yeah, so I think the two main lessons I hope people would have was one, nationhood, just that Native Americans have been polities for the whole time, and they still are. Like, I think that is maybe the number one misunderstanding that a lot of non-Native people have today. Native Americans are in polities. You are if you're a citizen, a member of a Native nation, a Native community, that's how you're Native American today. And then the second is just that long survival story, that just the ways in which Native women, Native men have adapted while holding on to their Native identities, their Native communities is really, it's a hero story. And it's a time, these days we don't have that many of those. And I think all the stories of tragedy are real, and many of them are in this book. But I think too often we've told Native history as one of tragedy and decline. And if we sort of spread it out, slow it down, bring in, not just focus on Indian removal and the Allotment Act and the boarding schools, all of which are tremendously important, but also look at earlier time periods and later time periods to today. This is a longer story that has a lot more in it and a lot more joy and survival and persistence in it than when we just look at the moments of the greatest tragedy.
And I had mentioned to you earlier, and I think a great opportunity for interdisciplinary collaboration between STEM teachers and social study teachers.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. All right. Now I'm going to pass it over to Ryan, who's going to ask our student scholar question of the week. Take it away, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina. As always, that was really awesome to listen to. And for folks who might be newer to the program, we always begin this part of the show with our history scholar question of the week. This is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our great guests a question, and they have a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History gift shop. And this week, our winner is Cherish Frazier, who attends Green Valley High School in Nevada. And the question is this: what were some of the biggest challenges you faced in researching and writing about the complex histories of these indigenous nations, particularly in ensuring their perspectives and voices were represented with authenticity?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a non-native scholar. And so that was, but maybe I think your question is like the most important thing that I was thinking about the whole time I was writing this. And I should say first, like, I have a long list in the back of the book of further reading, almost all of which is by native scholars on their particular tribes. And so in no way is what I've written the final word. I mean, no, history is the final word. That's not even the right way to put it, but like the most in-depth way to learn that nation's history. This book is in fewer than 1,000 pages, it covers 1,000 years. So I want to say that first. And then what I tried to do is I guess do what I think a good historian should always do, and try to think of no source as perfect, but no source as not worth including. And so there are lots of times when I bring in, say the way a history is told in, I'll just give one example, like the Tohono O'odham in their cultural center and museum. They have an overview of it's kind of like a timeline, things that happened in their history. And what it says for what we would think of as the colonial period, the Spanish and Mexican periods of, what was Arizona before it becomes part of the United States. It basically says, the Spaniards and Mexicans came in such small numbers, they really didn't affect us. And then it goes on to talk about lots of O'odham things that have nothing to do with them. And I thought, that is really, that's right? That is really important. And so I quote that, but also use that to frame the whole, the way I tell that part of history. And that helped me to rethink things that Spanish explorers said. There's a Spanish priest who goes through and he puts crosses on a map. He draws a map of all the towns that he goes to in what's now Arizona, all the O'odham towns. And he puts a little picture of a church with a cross on top in almost everyone that he visited. And people have looked at that map and thought there was a mission there, and really thought Spanish colonialism was real. And yet I think as the Tohono O'odham description tells us, it's not true. And in fact, there were no missions there. They were just places he had visited once. One priest visited once in most of these places. No priest was stationed there in all but like 2 or 3 of them, and even those didn't have a permanent priest. So that's another example, I think, of how ways that Native nations tell their history today reflects on this distant past. Now, because I'm talking about Native nations, you'll hear me, like, most of what I depend on is sort of tribal scholars or Native nations depictions of their own past. Now, individual Native people, just like all people, have wildly different opinions about stuff than each other. So that's another reason to read lots of books by individual Native writers to give lots of different perspectives on this long history through the present.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Cherish, for that great question, and thank you for that great answer. And now turning our attention to our Q&A section from our great audience. Ethan asks, in what ways did Native American tribes compete with one another, besides resources and territory? Are there any other ways that they competed with each other?
Yeah, lots of different ways. And I'm glad you already said resources and territory, because some people might get the misinterpret from sort of the big picture that I'm giving, that there's not native warfare, because there's lots of native warfare, right? So, but there are other ways that they competed too. One of my sort of favorites from the distant past, again, is that the cities of the Hohokam, who are the ancestors of the O'odham in what's now Arizona and Sonora, the Mexican state of Sonora, they played ball basically against each other. So in their cities were these large sunken oval ball courts and lots of seating around them for people to observe. And so they would definitely compete with other towns. So these are all O'odham peoples, but maybe they played other peoples too, but we know they played each other. But they would travel to towns and clearly have these competitive games. Now I talked about the rise, sort of that there were leaders who tried to claim more power and take more power in the periods right before the fall. One of the ways that we know this is that many of, maybe all of the Hohokam towns at one point built over those ball courts, stopped playing ball there, and instead built a sort of more pyramid type structures on top of them, with temples on top of those pyramids where only the sort of priestly elite could go. And sort of it's such a vivid sort of representation of a changing power system, from like ball games that everybody can go to what's going on politically and religiously is literally out of your sight because it's on top of a temple mound.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you for that. One interesting question from our audience is this, and it's from Peter, who says, "I teach at a school that borders the Paiute Reservation." I'm going to spell it. It's Paiute. So I'm so sorry for my pronunciation. But he goes, Peter goes on to say, "Our school population is about 50%. In teaching about the tribal history taking place up until the late 1800s, the resilience that they showed, I wonder what their ancestors would think about the various tribal societies today."
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess it might be a good question to ask the students what they think, because nobody really knows the answer. So it's a good open-ended question. But I don't know. I think, for one thing, they'd be surprised at how awful it was in the late 19th century and the 20th century, and how much they would be very sad at how much their descendants had to live through. But I hope they would also be proud that they kept being Paiute through everything, all these efforts to try to keep them from being that. Good. Keep up the good work.
And relatedly, another question that has a similar theme is from Craig, who says, "I was thinking of assigning my students a project this year where they have to create a narrative on a specific Native American nation, using your book as a resource. In general, how can teachers best help their students understand that tribal nations of different eras and geographic regions had dramatic economic, social, and cultural differences?"
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. Certainly, I think my book and other books like it can help make that point over and over, right? How different they are in different eras, different places. One of the things I do here is I try to not cover, because I chose tribes in different parts of the continent, so that we had some West and some Northeast and some Southeast and some Middle. I think for school projects, there's so many great tribal websites out there these days that make all kinds of good points. One of the things I do with my students, for one thing, is I have them just look at a tribal website. And one of the first things they notice, because they're going there for history, right? But one of the things they first notice is that almost everything there is the same kind of thing you would find on a county website. It's social services, it's childcare, it's tribal membership. These are governments, right? These are functioning governments that do the things that governments do. So I think just having students see that is really powerful, and it maybe gets that lesson of Native nationhood into their heads better than a whole book can do. But then also, almost all of them have a sort of history and culture section. And just, I think I can just imagine it now that you say it, sort of assigning students different tribes. And just, I think that will, the way those tribes tell their history, the things that happen to them, so say one of them is the Pamunkeys who were, Pocahontas's tribe, right? Who met the English from the beginning and had some of the worst, earliest experiences with colonialism. And another is, say, the Paiutes, who colonialism takes a lot longer to get to them. They're going to tell very different histories on probably even right there on their websites, right? I don't want to make promises about those two websites at the moment, because websites come and go. I think you would want to do a little bit of looking at the websites first before you let the students choose them. But yeah, I think that sounds like a great project. And if you incorporated kind of some tribal websites, it might add to it.
Yeah, and I was just sorry to cut you off. I was just going to say that we encourage all the great teachers on the call, to use this great book as a resource, and there's links to get your hands on it in the chat. So please, we really encourage that. Sam says, "My understanding is that the horse was reintroduced in North America by the Spanish in the late 1500s. Can you describe how different Native societies, economies, and politics were changed by this new transportation, vis-a-vis work, warfare, the warfare platform, et cetera, the importance of the horse?"
Yeah, the sort of increased use of the horse just dramatically changed lives for a great number of people living near and on the plains. So it made possible. So there's this stereotype of Native Americans as nomadic, right? Almost nobody was nomadic before the coming of the horse, but the horse really allowed for a nomadic lifestyle, for people not to have a central town that they lived in and to live on the road, right? With these huge herds of horses. And so there are peoples like the Kiowas, the Comanches, who completely changed their way of life, who used to live in towns on rivers, on rivers, right? Where they did some farming and some hunting, and became fully horsebound people who mostly just hunted and some gathering, but mostly hunted, but then traded with other people. So one of the important things to sort of gets back at our sort of diversity of tribes point, is that there are people who decided not to do that. The horse came and they were like, that seems kind of useful, but they didn't change. They kept living in their villages on rivers, and they traded with people who lived on horses, like the Comanches and the Kiowas, and got more bison products that way. But actually became more prosperous farming towns than they'd been before because of this new trade. So it really changed the lives of people who took up the horse. I tell my students about sort of about the sort of way it might, and it's described in the oral history, like the way it changes how you see yourself when you are a horsebound people, when you can fly across the plains and see more places and be mobile. Now, I should add that there has been recent archaeology that has found horses maybe a little earlier than we thought. So this is one of those things where I now am telling my students, in the same way that I talk about how long have people been in North America, like next time I lecture on this, it'll probably be a different answer, because people are finding all kinds of different things. And there are definitely people who are saying horses have been here longer. I mean, we know that there were horses long ago, but the assumption has been that those became extinct, and then the Spanish brought horses when they came in the 1500s. And it also has been, the plains culture, sort of horse culture, was assumed not to have started until after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when the Pueblo peoples were able to start selling horses out on the plains. I think it's almost certain that that date is going to be revised, that there were plains people who were starting to hunt full time well before 1680. That whether there were horses here, say in 1500 or not, is completely up in the air. But it's clear that at some point in the 1500s and 1600s, something dramatically changed, and there were peoples who became, what you're talking about, this sort of this nomadic horsebound culture.
Maybe that's for someone in our audience today to do more research on.
Yes.
Future archaeologists and anthropologists and historians.
Right.
Shannon says that the Cahokia is always mentioned, but I would love to know more about the large southern Georgia mound builders, which is now preserved in a national park. How do they fit into the story? And Shannon goes on to mention the park, and that there's evidence of 1700, a long history of continuous habitation there, and a ceremonial room built under and inside the largest architectural preserve. So just a little bit about that area and what's today Georgia.
Yeah, right. I think you're talking about Etowah, which is a major mound. So archaeologists call these all Mississippian. So Cahokia, Etowah, Moundville in Alabama, and then lots and lots, hundreds maybe of smaller ones as well, and some as big as Etowah and Moundville. They're all part of this this transition from, there's an era before where there's small, sort of medium-sized towns with sort of medium-scale agriculture maybe, and then there's this acceleration around the time of the rise of Cahokia, and so they all follow this from a wide perspective. They all follow this sort of rise and fall. But when you look more closely, they're quite different from each other. They actually don't all have the same political structures. Etowah has some similarities and some differences from Cahokia. Cahokia is the biggest one. So in the book, I write about Cahokia and I write about Moundville. Those are the two Mississippian ones I write about. And so off the top of my head, my Etowah history is not quite as sharp as those. It sounds like you are more up to date on it, but it's one of the most important Mississippian sites for sure. And I think fits into this general narrative of a time of centralization and then a time of decentralization.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions in our chat from various audience members who are just asking if you could talk a little bit about the phenomenon of slavery in the Americas and how does that fit into your story? Chattel slavery. Does that fit into your story? How does it compete with Natives' view of society and life, and just a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things I always tell my students is that something that we could think of as slavery existed in North America for as long as we know. And it is very similar to the kinds of slavery that are all around the world before the early modern era. And that is that there are war captives. You take somebody captive in war. What do you do with them? Sometimes they became slaves, right? And that might not be passed on to their descendants. That might not limit them from some kinds of participation in the society, or it might. But it's very different from chattel slavery, right? So that definitely existed in North America way back. Where I talk most about chattel slavery here, sort of particularly what becomes antebellum plantation slavery, is in the chapters I have that deal with the Cherokees. So I focus on the Cherokees in the early 19th century, when the Cherokees are building a nation in certain ways that are similar to the way the United States is building. They establish a newspaper and legislature, bicameral legislature, constitution. And some of that is just because they think that's the way a nation should be in the early 19th century. Some of that is for sort of protecting themselves against the United States. Like, the more they can act in a centralized way, the more they hope they'll be able to retain their lands in the East. And some Cherokees made the immoral economic choice that many of their white neighbors were making at the time, and began to practice kind of slavery that was very different from the kind of slavery their ancestors had, buying and selling people of African descent, and having them work on cotton plantations. So you could go to plantations in what's now northern Georgia, and what at the time was the Cherokee Nation, and see cotton plantations with the same kind of sort of forced labor that you would see on white-owned Georgia cotton plantations. So yeah.
Fascinating.
Right.
And just keeping an eye on time, hopefully we have time for a couple more questions. And one comes from Sandy, who says thanks you for sharing this book with us. I'm working on research of Native American stories in my region. I struggle with the right labels to use: Indigenous, Native, Indian. You mentioned a previous graduate student who wrote an article or completed a study on the importance of using the right words. If you could just share a little bit about of your expertise on the vernacular when going about doing research and writing about this stuff.
Yeah. So I think one of the most important things is just to be honest with students and say sort of that double message that I said at the beginning. First, that generic terms are not great, right? That it's better to use specific terms. That then can be complicated too, because some people have been sort of named by other people. Sometimes they're enemies, and the name that we know them as is not the name they want to be called. And but all those things I think are really good conversations to have with students. And then the sort of what the generic name should be. I can send the link to the article by my students, because I think it's really useful, and at least for teachers to read, if not for students to read. But just saying, these things change over time, and none of them, Indian, Indigenous, Native, none of those are bad words. And words, they come and go. And Indian is out of favor now. And so I would start I just started about myself. I have moved toward Native and Indigenous. Sometimes I think Native American is not a very common word term that Native people use for themselves, but it can be useful for talking to students just to make sure they know what you're talking about, right? So I don't know. I think sort of trying to do our best, but also letting students a little bit into the process of how language changes and how changing with language and trying to call people what they want to be called is a process, and it's tremendously important and respectful, but it also is not, it's not cut and dry.
Fascinating. And if you want to share that article with me, I'd be happy to be a
Okay.
third party intermediate and share it. If anybody is interested in reading it, feel free to reach out to me.
Terrific.
Midweek. Again, perhaps we have time for one or two more questions. James says he's reading your book right now, and it's wonderful. Would you have any helpful advice for a pronunciation guide to some of the recurring names as James is going through your book? It's helpful for him to know how to pronounce the names correctly.
Yeah. Oh, that's so. I wish there were a way to do that. I especially wish in the ebook there was some, I'm sure in 10 years that we'll have it so that you can just push on it and it'll tell you how to pronounce it. I did. This may not be that helpful, but I worked pretty hard with the reader of the audiobook, the narrator of the audiobook. And so she gets all the pronunciations as right, at least as I could get them. So if you have the audiobook, that could be quite helpful. But also a lot of tribes put out, TikTok videos and other things about how to say their names. And if you can find that by a tribal member, then I would use that. So sometimes just a Google search will get you as good a pronunciation as any.
Fascinating. And Sam would like to know quickly if you have any theories about the Coahuila network of city-states in Illinois. Speaking of bad pronunciation,
Right.
in this network of city-states in what's today Illinois, Missouri, and beyond. Do you have any theories as far as that collapse?
Oh yeah, right. So what seemed to happen at Cahokia was people just so with some of them there's more of a revolution and people really rise up against the leaders. In Cahokia, it seems that people just started leaving, and so archaeologists can see like the population just decline over time. And it's people. What seems to have happened is that when Cahokia was founded, lots of people came from other places to live there, right? You can imagine like people wanted to live in a city. There might all kinds of things might have drawn them to Cahokia. Some of them might have been forced or slightly forced to come there. And when things started falling apart, when there wasn't enough food, people just started leaving in family groups, leaving in neighborhood groups, maybe leaving in the group they had come with. Some of these may have been sort of semi-nations that came and then left together and became a nation that we know today. That's the sort of in the oral histories of the Quapaws and the Osage and other people, they tend to talk about leaving a place. And so it very likely was Cahokia or one of the other major centers in that region. So some of it definitely has to do with the climate change, with it becoming harder to feed everybody. And then we sort of have to imagine and use oral history a little bit to figure out what would that have actually been like to decide to leave a place and to start over somewhere else. But archaeology also shows, and oral history backs that up from the places that descend from Cahokia, the people spread out. I mean, it's pretty clear that the mystery of what happened to the people, the answer is they just went other places. So they're spread out from Missouri and Kansas and Oklahoma, Arkansas, and then in the east, all through the sort of Ohio Valley and into the South are descendants of some of Cahokia and some of other Mississippian centers. People spread out, I think, but I should just answer in one sentence. Yeah. People spread out.
And then perhaps a really important accumulating question could be from Jane, who says, before I throw it back to Gina for some final thoughts, Jane says, do you think that educational institutions should seek out a relationship with their local tribes and in the form of a land acknowledgement? And just, if you could talk a little bit about that land acknowledgement question in today, your views and thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think schools and teachers are really busy, and tribes and tribal officers are really busy. So I would never want to say you all have to spend a ton of time on this, because tribes are every bit as much stretched thin as schools are. And so what I don't like doing is suggesting you should get a tribal member to come talk to your class. Like that's, if there's somebody who'll do that, it's amazing, right? But it's not always, not always something they can provide. And so that's one of the reasons I suggest cultural centers if they already exist, field trips to see cultural centers, and just websites, because then that doesn't take anybody's, it doesn't take any tribal resources or time to access that. And then land acknowledgements, they're tricky, right? There are ways to do it right, and there are ways to do it wrong. And I would say the most important things in a land acknowledgement are be pretty sure that the people you mentioned really, did live in the place that you are. And even more importantly, far too often land acknowledgements give the impression that Native Americans are just in the past. These are the people who used to live here, right? Instead of acknowledging that those tribes are still here, or in some cases, maybe that tribe is now in Oklahoma, but has a connection to your place as their home place. So find a way to make it connect to the present, and then the continuance of Native nations. And yes, if possible, get some help from the actual tribe to at least look it over. And sometimes they may have advice already on their website.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to throw it back to Gina right now, but to the folks that I did not get to answer their question or did not get their question asked, I'm sorry. We had so many questions today, but a great remedy for that is getting your hands on this great book, and all your answers can be found within those pages. Gina, back to you.
Yes, and I think that is such a huge testament to how invested people were in this work by the amount of questions that we had. And as to Ryan's point, if you purchase the book at bookchalk.org, and the link that's in the chat, the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for teachers and students. And we hope you'll join us next week as we welcome the author of The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. So a timely book for next week. And we hope you will go to our website, where you can view more than 200 scholar presentations of book breaks at gilderlerman.org/book breaks. And that's including Kathleen's last appearance with us. So you can take a chance to watch that if you want a double feature today. And you can also visit our website for documents, essays, digital exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. We hope everyone has a fantastic start of the school year, who is starting right now. And Kathleen, thank you again for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Gina and Ryan. What a pleasure.
Have a great day, everybody.